This is a horn. This is Louis Armstrong, as he effervescently rouses a crowd with that oh-so-popular song, What a Wonderful World.
What a wonderful world.
Known not only for his prolific mastery of the trumpet, but also for his warm and inviting smile, Armstrong has long been cherished among jazz aficionados and musicians of the like. However, behind every smile is a story yet to be told. Somewhere in the scars of his lips and in the brightness of his pearly whites is a story of pain, strength, disappointment, and determination.
And I think to myself, what a wonderful world. I see skies of blue.
Beans and rice. Armstrong was born in New Orleans on August 4th, 1901, only 36 years after the ratification of the 13th Amendment that ended slavery. Well, except it didn't really end slavery. The next several decades consisted of previously enslaved blacks working as sharecroppers. The 13th Amendment states, quote, "Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction." This statement essentially means that slavery is outlawed except if you are convicted of a crime. So this was the backdrop of Louis's early life. Now for his family life, well, that tale is not all roses and sunshine either. His parents were Mary Albert and William Armstrong. Mary was from Booty, Louisiana, and gave birth to him when she was about 16. Shortly after, Louis's parents split. Louis was actually raised by his grandmother until the age of 5. It's important to note that after years of chattel slavery and then several decades of sharecropping actually destabilized the nuclear black family. Louis spent his youth in poverty in a rough neighborhood aptly known as the Battlefield. At 6, he attended the Fisk School for Boys, a school that accepted black children in the racially segregated school system of New Orleans. But that scrappy lifestyle on the streets of New Orleans didn't come without its challenges. In fact, as a preteen, Louis took up odd jobs and stints as a street performer. To distinguish himself from other hawkers, he tried playing a tin horn to attract customers. His neighbor Morris Karnofsky gave Armstrong an advance towards a purchase of a cornet from the pawn shop, and the rest was history. But that scrappy life on the streets of New Orleans didn't come without its challenges. In fact, trouble didn't seem too hard to find. Borrowing his stepfather's gun without permission, the preteen fired a blank into the air and was arrested on December 31st, 1912. He spent the night at a New Orleans juvenile court, then was sentenced the next day to detention at the Waif's home for colored boys. Conditions were grueling for blacks in America at this time. This could be no more true than for Louis, who was lucky to even have a piece of stale bread to eat at night. He later found a job at a dance hall owned by Henry Ponce, who actually had connections with the mob, ushering Armstrong into a whole different side of life. He met the 6-foot-tall drummer, Black Benny, who became his guide and bodyguard, in case things got hairy, see? But Louis was determined to make something of himself. While selling coal in Storyville, he heard spasm bands, which were, now get this, groups that played music using household objects. So I guess you could say it was in the tinks of forks and chattering of spoons that gave Louis the first taste of silvery tones of early jazz. Young Louis was also enamored with the jumping tunes of bands that played in brothels and dance halls such as Pete Lala's, where King Oliver performed.
And I think to myself,
a glimmer of hope.
What a wonderful world.
Armstrong played in brass bands and riverboats in New Orleans, first on an excursion boat in September 1918. He traveled with the band of Fate Marble, which toured on the steamboat Sydney. Louis had been bitten by the jazz bug and needed to trade in his beans and rice for steak and fine champagne. The first stop on the map was Chicago. Although race relations were a little bit dicey, well, actually they were horrible, the budding music scene did offer fertile ground for an astute musician like Lewis. The city also had other jobs for blacks, making good wages in factories, and then a few left over here and there for entertainment. In fact, the turn of the century experienced what was called the Great Migration, where formerly enslaved blacks and their descendants moved to cities like Chicago and New York to start new lives, while others of their family members chose to stay back home and sharecrop or start their own businesses. Oliver's band was among the most influential jazz bands in Chicago in the early 1920s. Armstrong lived luxuriously in his own apartment with his first private bath. Excited as he was to be in Chicago, he began his career-long pastime of writing letters to friends in New Orleans, many of whom he had nicknamed after food. Armstrong had grown his reputation and was known to have blown 200 high Cs in a row. His first studio recordings were with Oliver for Gannett Records in 1923. However, the quality of the performances were affected by lack of rehearsal, crude recording equipment, and bad acoustics. In addition, Richmond, Virginia, where they were recording, was also associated by KKK activity. On the other hand, the sexy and curvy art of Art Deco and the thumping melodies of swing and jazz during the Harlem Renaissance beckoned Lewis to New York City. Harlem, New York became a light beacon for young black talent eager to see their name in lights. It was a city that blacks could shake off the shame of their centuries of bondage, or so they thought. As they say, with new levels comes new devils. Harlem was also a very dangerous place for blacks, as the hate groups grew in numbers as well as organized crime from the likes of the mafia. The nightclubs and cabarets where Lewis performed were not only places of music and art and dance, but were also places of debauchery and business. And yes, I mean that kind of business.
And I think to myself,
More than a trumpet.
what a wonderful world.
Throughout the turn of the century, Armstrong had developed an unmatched impact on jazz and culture. Even world-renowned authors like Langston Hughes honored and acknowledged the work of Armstrong. Lewis brought not only honky-tonk and big band swing to the scene, but also brought something unique to his music. Well, his voice.
I see skies of blue, red roses too.
Police! Police! Help! Police! Help! Police! Help! Help! Police!
Okay, that was terrible, but while Lewis's style was exciting and fresh, it was also upsetting to the status quo. As America left the more stuffy and ornate Gilded Age, jazz was already being seen as a taboo. Lewis's unrefined and gravelly voice at times was unsettling to white audiences. In fact, white audiences didn't always know how to receive Armstrong. For one thing, he didn't change his personality for anyone. He would tell you in his down south accent exactly what needed to be said. He also brought a certain confidence and bravado to his performances that may have offended some more conservative sensibilities. One area that Lewis had no problem speaking up on was food. Yes, our dear brother Lewis was quite the gourmand. He enjoyed all delectable pleasures he could get his hands on, even naming some of his very special associates after sweets and other foods. I mean, take a look at this carefully crafted recipe for Creole beans and rice, a la Armstrong. Remembering how empty his cupboards were as a child, he made sure that there was never any shortage of good eats or good women, for that matter. By 1943, however, Lewis was on his fourth wife. Hey, like they said, fourth time's a charm, or something like that. Her name was Lucille, and he loved Lucille. They traveled the world together, as you can see in this famous picture of Lewis at the Great Pyramids of Giza playing to his wife. She was a young lady that Lewis had met on the road. Legend has it she was tired of living out of a suitcase alongside Lewis, so the couple settled in a beautiful home in Queens, New York, which is now the site of the Armstrong Family Museum. In 1943, he recorded Hoagie Carmichael's Rockin' Chair by OK Records and continued to hone his craft.
Rocking chair's got me. Old rocking chair got your father. Cane by my side. And your cane by your side.
While in the 1940s, Armstrong continued to record, his life was certainly no picnic. Lewis was constantly haunted by threats of violence from the mafia, and not to mention the astronomical rise in anti-black hate groups during the mid-century. During the next 30 years, Armstrong played more than 300 performances a year. However, times were changing. Bookings for big bands tapered off during the 40s due to the changing public tastes. Ballrooms closed, and there was competition from television and other types of music becoming more popular than big bands, so it became impossible under the circumstances to finance a 16-piece touring band. However, during the 1940s, a widespread revival of interest in the traditional jazz of the 1920s made it possible for Lewis to consider a return to the small group style of his youth. Armstrong was featured as a guest artist in Lionel Hampton's band at the famed Second Cavalcade of Jazz concert held in Wrigley Field in Los Angeles, which was produced by Leon Heflin Sr. In the following years, Lewis continued to perform around the country.
And I think to myself,
Not So Wonderful World.
wonderful world.
By the 1950s, Lewis was a widely beloved American icon, so much so that he was selected by the US government to be a cultural ambassador. However, a growing generational gap became apparent between him and young jazz musicians who emerged in the post-war era, such as Charlie Parker, Miles Davis, and Sonny Rollins. The post-war generation regarded their music as abstract art and considered Armstrong's vaudevillian style, half musician, half stage entertainer, outmoded and Uncle Tom-like. As blacks strived to establish a political footing, many of the community saw the image of Satchmo as a reminder of minstrelsy, which would set the civil rights movement back. How could they take such a grinning relic seriously? He called bebop Chinese music, for heaven's sake. While touring Australia in 1954, he was asked if he could play bebop, and he responded, "Bebop? I just play music. Guys who invent terms like that are walking in the streets with instruments under their arms." So you can see from his comments how some of the younger crowd started to see him as passé and old worldly. In fact, young civil rights activists also grew frustrated with Armstrong because he often had a mild response to some of the more extreme racial tensions during the time. However, Lewis didn't let this stop him. He continued to record with the likes of Ella Fitzgerald and also did recordings for Porgy and Bess. And then also in 1964, after 2 years without setting foot in the studio, he recorded the biggest selling record, Hello Dolly, which is a song by Jerry Herman, originally sung by Carol Channing. Armstrong's version remained at the top 100 for 22 weeks, longer than any other record produced that year. Armstrong also did a tour of Africa, specifically in Nigeria and Ghana. In fact, Armstrong kept touring well into his 60s, even visiting parts of the communist bloc in 1965. In addition to Africa, he also toured Europe and Asia under the sponsorship of the US State Department.
Here's a little French tune we gonna swing for you, called C'est si bon.
The rough life of a musician had started to catch up with Lewis, and even resulting in his lips exploding from the pressure of years of playing the trumpet. As he approached his 70s, his health began to give out, and he suffered a heart attack and kidney ailments which forced him to stop touring. He didn't perform publicly at all in 1969 and passed away a year later. Armstrong is a peculiar figure who does not get the amount of recognition that he so deserves. His fame grew and waned over the life of his career. Being born to humble beginnings in New Orleans, he carried with him an understanding of pain, a pain that he hid all too well behind his big pearly white smile. Lewis was also hated throughout his career. People saw him as unpolished, as a country bumpkin who could not keep up with the times. Whether he was too rough for the 1920s jazz or too old-fashioned for the 1960s jazz, he was always met with some sort of opposition. Despite his struggles and even addiction to the nightlife and to food and women during his early career, and despite his health challenges in his later life, he always was able to smile. While Armstrong was not perfect, he lived his life in full color, and that's pretty damn cool considering his opposition. His smile and his music live on today and continue to inspire people all around the world. If you would like to learn more about inspiring people, subscribe to the Inspired Learning channel and click that little bell button so that you get notifications each and every time we upload to the channel. Thank you, and remember, stay inspired.